Good morning and welcome. Thank you for tuning in for this conversation with Max Taylor, Professor Emeritus at University College London. Max, it's really great to see you again. I'd like to talk to you for about 45 minutes or so about a variety of topics of interest to readers of the journal Terrorism and Political Violence. Let's begin with your earliest recollection with studying terrorism. Was something that you wanted to do? Were you a graduate student, an undergraduate student? What inspired you to pursue this field of study?
Accident, probably, um, but not, well, not real. Yes, accident, but circumstances as well. My origins are as a psychologist. I first degree in psychology, PhD in behavioral pharmacology. So, and then I worked in the area of drug effects on behaviour in Wales and in Canada. I was in Montreal for a couple of years at a place called Centre for Research on Drug Dependence, which was a very physiologically focused outfit, very high, very, I think, a very good one, to be honest. And they did all sorts of really interesting things. Um, for all sorts of reasons, we left Canada, and I had to get a job, as you do. So I ended up as head of department in a college in Northern Ireland. And the intention was to carry on with the drugs work, but that wasn't realistic. I mean, in the absence of a really well-resourced lab and all the stuff that goes with it, the sort of things I've been doing just wasn't possible. Which actually was fine because I was beginning to feel that I wasn't really sure that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I mean, it was really, really interesting stuff, but not beyond where I wanted to be, I think. I think what's driven me and what was the case then as well, I've always been interested in the application of psychology. And that's really what's characterized whatever the things I've done in my career. It's been about applying psychology. Um, my mother wanted me to be a policeman. I know that. So that might be in part why terrorism sort of I drifted into or became engaged with terrorism. But as these things go, it was a set of accidents. I met someone else. I became very involved with um, police work in Northern Ireland and working with the RUC. And in particular, my role in that was to look at ways of enabling police officers, on the ground officers, to work and patrol in dangerous environments. Um, so I was a member of there was a working party called Policing in Hard Areas, and that was the vehicle which um, through which I became most involved with or introduced and then much involved in terrorism work. But the interest there, and it's an interest which has persisted, I think, throughout my career, has been. I'm interested in policy, but I'm much more interested in what people do and how people work on the ground. And that was really what that was all about. Now, that was in the context of the troubles in Northern Ireland, really bad times in the pre-hunger strike period. It was things were really bad. It was very dangerous for policemen, um, and the government took a decision to move towards something called police primacy. Until, in the main, actual policing, if you could call it that, was done by the army. I mean, patrolling, things like that were army. The police might have been with an army crew because they would have had powers of arrest or whatever. But really, the work was being done by the army, and police primacy was about shifting the balance away from the army to the police engaging in patrolling work and generally work. There was a degree of contact between people in Republican areas, which is where I was focused, and the police, but it was always to do with things like insurance requirements. If your car was stolen or whatever, you had to report it to the police because that was the step in the way to getting insurance cover and things. But there was no routine engagement with policing, and it was very dangerous, and it remained so. I'm not suggesting anything we did anything other than dangerous, but that introduced me to thinking about terrorism, and I was very fortunate in working with a man called Bill Wilson. Bill was a quite extraordinary policeman, I think. He ended up as chief superintendent. He had, I think he was the inspector in Andersonstown. Andersonstown police station was right in the middle of a difficult West Belfast area. And the police used to go in there, escorted by the military. They'd stay there for however long and then come out. And there was nothing much happening. And Bill got bored. This is his account. He said he got bored and he did a degree with the Open University. And then he did a master's degree, again, through Cranfield, I think it was. And he just was a very, very interesting man who, clearly extremely talented. And he introduced me to policing terrorism. I spent days and hours and weeks and whatever, endlessly on patrols, out on the ground, looking at what a police crew did in that kind of environment. That was how we developed the programs that we developed. So that was really the starting point to it. And then it went on from then. I then moved to the Republic of Ireland and moved down to Cork. And the interest continued there. Then, based in Cork, I became very interested in the loyalist paramilitaries. And again, that involved going up there and meeting them and so on. And I met at that time, or around that time, the leadership of the UDA, and got to know some of the people quite well. And that work and the earlier work in Northern Ireland was the basis really for my first book, The Terrorist. And it really drew on that kind of stuff. And then the other two that came afterwards drew on that kind of experience. So that's the story. I mean, to say that I set out to be a dedicated terrorism scholar would be entirely untrue. But that's the way it worked out. But as I said, I think the core remains. It's not changed. Is applying psychology in difficult environments. That also got extended into other kinds of difficult environments. For a lot of reasons, I ended up in Sudan and working with the Sudanese police. That then had difficulties there when the president Bashir became the president, and the whole process of Islamicization and so on, and we couldn't stay there in the end. So that we moved out and were accommodated in Ethiopia, which was also just at that time coming out of its war with Eritrea and so on. So I found myself in wars as much as terrorism. Again, and I think it's always the way of these things. Someone who I owe a great debt to was Paul Ignatieff. And Paul was, at that time, the UNICEF representative in Ethiopia, and he encouraged us to go there and facilitated it and so on. And then subsequently, Paul then went to UNICEF headquarters in New York and was involved in fundraising and stuff. I went to visit him on one occasion, and he said, "Why, he would like me." Or, no, that's not quite the right words. He thought it would be interesting if I went to Bosnia, because at that time the war in Bosnia was going, and he felt that the sort of things I was interested in would be of interest to the UNICEF special representative in former Yugoslavia. So I went, and out of that came the work we did in Sarajevo. So we had a president. I would visit. I became a war tourist, I think would be the way to look on it, because I would go in and out. But we had people there for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, 4 years perhaps. A couple of psychologists, a social work, well, three psychologists, a social worker, and a psychiatric nurse. Um, and there the work was UNICEF-based work related to children in war environments. We didn't engage, well, I was going to say we didn't engage with delivery of services, but in that kind of environment, you do what you can. I mean, the office was just two internationals, so that it blurred, boundaries became quite blurred there. But, so that was sort of started off in terrorism and then moved into war conflict settings as well. But again, it was always about applying psychology. That seemed to me to be the core of it all, that in these rather strange environments, what did we have to offer? And sometimes the answer to that was nothing. And sometimes the answer to it was helpful things, I hope. There, does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, it sound. I mean, when we were talking about your initial work in Northern Ireland specifically, I started thinking, gee, I wonder why you didn't gravitate into criminology and criminal justice types of policing research. But then as you moved on, it seems like you kind of remained focused on the psychology and the sort of the influences of behavior and the consequences of that behavior from a psychological perspective, regardless in the Northern Ireland context or now in Sudan and in Bosnia and so forth.
Yeah.
It seems like a very
Well,
constant theme.
oddly enough, I did also. I mean, one of the other threads to my career has been an involvement with rational choice theory and criminological thinking, and we did some very early work on rational choice in target selection in burglars, which I think was probably quite innovative in its time. And the reason I've ended up in UCL is because UCL would be major, one of the most comfortable environments for someone with an interest in rational choice theories would end up in. So yeah, I mean, the conflict stuff is one thread, but underneath that, again, I think it's again about applying psychology, and that my background was very much in operant conditioning. Um, and I wrote a paper a long time ago exploring links between radical behaviors and rational choice theory. And so there is a thread there of an engagement with criminology and criminological thinking. And I think that, oddly enough, emerged in a slightly different way with the child protection work that I became involved in later on in the Republic, related to internet crimes, because that was very much focused on a rational choice model.
Just focused on the study of terrorism here, what have been some of the most challenging aspects of your work in the study of terrorism?
Well, one is getting access to I mean, it's easy to read about things, but if you want to meet people, it's not easy.
Right.
Although it's not that it's not easy, it's also not difficult. But you need the threads and the contacts and the routes in. Um, Aside from anything else, you need to be safe as well when you're doing it. I've had interviews where interviews is not quite the right word, I think. I had met people where I'd asked to talk to someone and being met with whoever it was and their minder with a gun on his lap, and I don't think he was going to shoot me, he's making a point.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is a point behind that, which is that engaging sometimes with these people is the wrong way to put it. That's being derogatory. I don't mean that. Engaging with people involved in this kind of activity can at times be very troubling. Equally, it's very rewarding, though. I've met some extraordinary people. And sometimes it's very uncomfortable for you because I've sat and had drinks with people, for example, and they're good fun and be very entertaining. And you know that a few weeks ago they killed people, and there's a
Hmm.
sort of, there is a very strange. You have to try and accommodate that, I suppose.
They rationally chose to kill people, and yet here they are just functioning as a normal
Oh,
human being.
I think sometimes yes, I mean
Hmm.
that yes, I suppose that's the way you're looking at it. I wouldn't have put it that way, but yes, I suppose that's how you're looking at it.
I want to go back to your book real quick, your 1988 book, The Terrorist. Um, did you have any trouble approaching publishers to get a book like that published?
No, no, and again, I was very fortunate in this. I approached Brass's defense publishers. And Brass's they don't exist anymore. They were taken over by, I think, by Pergamon, and then they just disappeared in the end. But they were in that, I think they were the oldest defense publishers. I don't know when they started to publish books, kind of 18th, 19th century. Very much kind of the British establishment authors, military people writing for them and things like that. As I recall, the managing director was a major general or ex-major general, and the people you worked with were all military. But no, they were really welcoming. It was really good. It was a very interesting introduction to publishing, which is now gone. People there, they were very civilized, and you were entertained for lunch, and you had it was very pleasant. And we were all on very good terms, and they had no problems, and so on. That's not the way it is now, is it?
No, it's not. You're absolutely right.
No, so I mean, no, but that getting it published wasn't a problem at all. They were a bit sensitive about sort of odd things. I mean, you look back on it now as being a bit odd, funny, but I remember that there was not a big issue, but they made an issue of using the abbreviation RAF because I was writing about the Red Army faction or Red Army faction. And so you abbreviate them RAF, and they didn't like that because they thought it might be mistaken for the Royal Air Force. And
Hmm.
so we had to change all things like that. But no, it was fine. They were lovely people to work with, and I think they published the next two as well.
Yeah, they published your 1991 book, The Fanatics.
Yeah,
It's about the behavioral approach to political violence. I wanted to ask you about that in terms of the differences between the book The Terrorist and the book The Fanatics and the terminology, any different terminologies that you might have been using back then.
what's always struck me is that terrorism is a subset of something else. There's a broader story of which terrorism is one part, and I felt that terrorism fitted into this broader story of violence, of kinds of violence, of directed violence. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it might be religious or whatever. Um, so that's the reason why I went down that route. Another person, I have to say this, who encouraged me to do that was David Rappaport. Um, and I sometimes think back um, on the early days when I met David. He used to talk about things, prompted incidentally by a paper which TPV will publish, I hope, by Jeff Kaplan, about David's earlier work, which was very much about millenarianism and the role of religion in violence and millenarianism and extreme violence. And that really hit with me. I thought that was very important way of thinking about things. So that's really that kind of aggregate of things led to the Fanaticism book. I always felt that book ended badly. I didn't like it. I didn't like the ending, and I mean, it had reached its end, so it went off. But I didn't like the final chapters in it, and I think I'll probably do a better book now, although I'm not going to.
I'm sure there's things we'd all do differently if we go back
Yeah,
in time
yeah,
and do them differently. I'm glad you brought up David Rappaport because I'd like to discuss with you about the history of the journal Terrorism and Political Violence,
sure.
capture a bit of oral
Yeah,
history of
yeah.
the journal. You've been one of the editors of this journal for many years now. When did you first become involved with the journal, and have you always had an editorial role?
No, no, no. I think this story, as it were, goes back well before goes back before the founding of the journal. In fact, um, many of your listeners or viewers won't remember how we used to work in the days before we had online libraries. You used to send off little cards for reprint requests, and you'd say, somebody would you'd have something like current contents, which will give you the title pages of journals, and then you'd look down for things that looked interesting. And I never worked in a university that had anywhere remotely adequate library. There was never anything in that I wanted. So you used to send off reprint requests to people, and sometimes they'd be honoured, sometimes they wouldn't. And I sent one off to David. I didn't know him. I knew of his work, but I didn't know him. I can't remember what the paper was I asked for, but he wrote back to me with the paper, and he also wrote back a note saying, "Why is a psychologist interested in this stuff?" And I replied to him, and on it went. It just kind of gathered momentum. Eventually, I went to LA. I went to LA to go to the Wiesenthal Center, I think, but also called in on David then. So that was the first time I met him, and that would have been in the 80s. Must have been in the 80s, yeah. And it kind of rolled on from then. We did, I think I published a few things in the journal when it first came out, the early days, and we did a special issue on future developments. I can't remember when that was, with John Horgan. And I'm sure that book that came out as a book, but I think it started off life as a TPV special issue. And I'd always reviewed for them as well. I mean, David would inundate, well, he had the same problems we all have now of finding adequate reviewers. So somebody who was willing to review got lumbered with loads of them. So I used to review for them. Can't remember when I became an editor. It's quite a long time ago. Um, I think it might have been when I moved to St Andrews. I think that might have been the time because that was when also interacting with Paul Wilkinson, who was the other founding editor of TPV. So it might have been from them. I can't remember.
Can you recollect how the journal got started with Paul and David? Was it a collaboration between the two, or
Oh, I think you have to think back to what it was like. There was no interest in terrorism. Um, I can remember conversations with some people who've, I think, moaning about or bemoaning the fact that there was no funding. I remember a conversation with somebody senior in the British government about it, about terrorism, and discussing things that you could do or not do or what was interesting. And they were just entirely dismissive. It wasn't an issue. Well, this wasn't a problem. Or they could manage it. That was the other bit to it. If it's a problem, we can deal with it. It's fine. So there wasn't a focus for developing ideas around terrorism. And David and Paul together, I think, provided that focus. They were really the only, not they weren't the only, but they were probably the most prominent. Paul Wilkinson, in particular, in the UK, would have been perhaps the most prominent person talking about terrorism in a public arena as well. And Paul was very much involved in broadcasting, and so I think there was a view abroad that there was a need for a focus. And that's how the journal emerged, because that's how academic developments occurs, and they people promulgate their ideas through some medium. And there was a need for that at that time, and the journal met that need.
and the journal was started a different name, wasn't it?
Called Journal, I think it was Journal of Terrorism Research or something, and it changed.
Mm.
I think the other thing there was that yeah, I think it might have been Paul who was the contact here with Frank Cass, a publisher, um, who, very much in the old-fashioned way of publishing. He did it. He made the decisions, and he was very helpful. And I think he probably shepherded the journal out and made it work and so on. So they had a very supported publisher, who then sold it in due course to Taylor and Francis.
And Taylor and Francis have had it for several
Yeah.
decades
Oh,
now.
yeah. Oh, a long time now. Yeah, a long time
We're in
now.
going to 37 now.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it was an appreciation that there was a need for um, something that gave a focus to academic work on terrorism. And if you look at the founding principles of the journal, it's very much about an academic study. It's about enabling ideas to be shared,
Mhm.
um, not about propagating a view, and that's important.
Well, I want to follow up on that. In a previous discussion, you had mentioned how Paul Wilkinson and many of his colleagues had a strong commitment to liberal democracy,
Very much
and
so.
that influenced their views on what TPV should or shouldn't publish. I was wondering, would you say that that underlying philosophy has remained throughout the subsequent changes at the
Oh,
journal?
yes, I think so. I mean, we've never, I think throughout, certainly throughout my involvement with it, um, there's never been a sense of direction in a sort of political exclusions or engagements or anything at all. I think we've always been driven by quality. That seems to me to be the defining attribute of a decent academic journal, and most certainly it is the case with TPV. I think we have always been driven by ideas and expressing ideas and enabling those ideas to be properly developed and engaged with by other people. I think we've been pretty successful at that.
I'd agree. I'd agree. Can I follow up with real quickly with you about the Center for Terrorism and Political Violence at St. Andrews? You joined St. Andrews in 2005, and you became the director of the center in 2009. What
Yeah.
exactly is the relationship between that center and the journal during that period of time?
Well, Paul retired. Paul and David together were editors. The way that it worked is that I think one issue David would edit, and then the next issue Paul would edit.
Okay.
So they sort of changed roles. No, it wasn't as automated as it is now. It was all done by in a much more I was going to say leisurely fashion. I don't think that's true, but a less formal fashion anyway, because that's the way things were then. Um, Paul used people in CSTPV for reviewing and engage and generally as much as anything because there weren't all that many other people around engaged in the area. I mean, CSTPV in the UK became certainly the first and remains, I think, the major focus for terrorism research. There was some scattered, certainly in the early days, there would have been scattered interest in other universities, but the core of it was in St Andrews. Um, and you can illustrate this in a way that I can't remember the date. I cannot for life me remember the date when this happened. But there was the first meeting of the KGB and UK people in Moscow, uh, and there were a number of people, a number of array of people went. I went. Paul was there as well. Um, there was no other university people from the UK there. Now, it's not diminishing what they were doing, but I think that says something about the prominence of St Andrews. That I didn't work there at that time; I was in Ireland. Um, but I think Paul was also very prominent in his engagement with the media, which is not something I've ever relished or wanted to do. But that's very important, I think. He certainly raised the profile of terrorism research in the UK.
A very famous scholar here in the U.S. called Ernest Boyer, who wound up being the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching.
Yeah,
And he wrote this fantastic book called Scholarship Reconsidered many years ago now. And part of it talked about different types of scholarship. And one of the types of scholarship that he promoted and encouraged people to consider was the scholarship of engagement. And this
yeah.
sounds like it certainly was something that Paul Wilkinson was very much involved in.
Paul was yes, and Paul had a very strong commitment, I think, to the idea of liberal democracy, the idea of, I think British politics, and you'd like to think US politics at its best, an openness, an engagement with things, a tolerance towards things. And this sounds awfully, I don't know what the word is, it sounds rather silly to say it, but it's kind of doing it right, working towards a better future. And I think that really was a quality of Paul's view in the world. He had a very optimistic view, I think, in many ways. I'm often criticised for having a pessimistic view, so I don't fit into that so readily.
Yeah, I've sometimes been called an optimist despite the lessons of history. Um, there's um, there's a lot of vantage point that comes from being an editor of a journal like TPV. From that vantage point, what have been some of the most significant trends or changes in the field of terrorism studies that you've observed over the last 20, 25 years?
Oh, I think we've become much more, we've recognised the need for evidence. I think that that would be the most striking thing, that we've moved away from ideas, talking about ideas or abstractions and generalities. And I think if you look at the kind of material that comes through TPV now, there's a lot more use of evidence, a lot more use of things like, now evidence is difficult in terrorism work. It's, you can't do experiments in this sort of experimental psychology sense. That's not that realistic. So you're always kind of one step removed from that, but much greater use of things like case studies, of um, engagement with people. That wouldn't have, certainly when I got involved in this, that wouldn't have been a quality that you would have identified with most of the terrorism research that was around. Um, and as an academic engaging with it, it was probably a little bit unusual. That wouldn't be the case now.
Well, in the next 5 or 10 years, what do you think would be the most significant things that we should look for in terms of study of terrorism, especially any topics in particular that you'd recommend new doctoral students or new emerging scholars should consider pursuing?
I think the obvious one is AI. Um, but I think we need to be careful. Um, Recently, I've been thinking about the psychological changes in the psychological nature of terrorism. That's not a very good way of expressing it, but that's occupied. I've been doing quite a bit of reading and engaging with people on that. And it seems to me that there's clearly issues around AI. There's issues around the internet and its distributed nature. There's issues around social media and the way that people engage with that. There's huge issues, I think, about the algorithms used in social media. And it seems to me an absolutely central problem for the future is going to be who controls those algorithms, who designs them, and who controls them. And I suppose if you think about potential AI implications, will they actually break free from control and, you know, start to operate with their own on their own, as it were? So that will be one kind of obvious thread of engagement. But I think you need to be careful because I don't know that terrorists are particularly innovative. Um, I mean, every now and again you get a blips on. I remember everybody was concerned about chemical warfare and terrorist use of chemical materials and stuff. Never materialized. Did a little bit, but nothing big. And the biggest thing was the use of really kind of well rehearsed tactic of hijacking in 9/11. Um, that wasn't, it was innovative use of existing things rather than adopting something entirely new. So I think you need to be quite careful, and perhaps there needs to be some thought to innovation as well as how do we accommodate to these new things that are coming along. I think I think another issue which is about understanding. I don't think it's about identifying new things, but I've been much impressed by recent reading has much impressed me around the ideas of Gestalt psychology. And the quality of the Gestalt psychologists was, first of all, that it was very much about their focus was on perception, which is very much an internet. The internet is about visual perception as much as anything else. So perception matters in thinking about the internet. And the other thing which the Gestalt psychologist talked about was the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the tradition I come from in operant conditioning is very much about parts and aggregating parts. And you think about role of reinforcement and kinds of reinforcement, things like that. It's all about parts, microanalyses of behavior building up. But I think there is something about there's something about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And I'm not sure that we've grasped what that means. I'm not sure I know what that means either, but I'm not sure we've really grasped what that means when we think about terrorism and innovation in terrorism. And so that will be a thread which I'm not pretending I've worked out by any means. But I would like, that's an idea I think that merits further looking at.
Well, good. Hopefully, someone reading this or watching this will be inspired to pursue that area of research in the future. We're pretty much running out of time here, getting close to 40 minutes. But is there anything that you'd like to tell readers of the Journal of Terrorism and Political Violence that we haven't already touched upon?
No, except do reviews for us. Um,
Yes, if you're qualified to do reviews, please contact us. We need you.
yeah, exactly. No, I think there is. I think a quality of being an academic is that you engage with the process. And the part of the academic process is peer reviewing, not just in the sense of in a journal, filling in a form or whatever it is, but being open to ideas and engaging with ideas and contributing to ideas. And I think the journals are absolutely vital in that respect. I fear for the way things are going. I'm not comfortable with the way that the academic journals have developed, and particularly not comfortable with the kind of commercialization that we've seen. Um, but engage, because that's the lifeblood of academic life, isn't it? To engage with things and to contribute, and then you will gain from that.
Mhm. Yeah, we all do.
I, yeah, I really look back on sometimes chance encounters, but particularly with someone like David Rappaport, a man of extraordinary knowledge and depth and interest. And just talking to him, actually thinking about this special issue on David's work, and of course his death last year, um, realize how unusual he was and how extraordinarily perceptive he was. Um, so I think if you wanted me to say what should students do now, read. Read some of the earlier stuff, because in fact you're discovering very often things, or appear to be discovering things that actually were discovered quite a long time ago and well worked out. And I think one of the complaints I would feel about quite a lot of the material we see in TPV is it's inventing wheels very often because they're not ready enough to know that somebody's already worked that out in the past. Um, and that's regrettable, but that's the nature of things, isn't it?
Yeah, we do see manuscripts like that submitted to us pretty regularly. Um, so before we conclude today's conversation, I would like to read to you something that John Horgan once said. For those listening, John Horgan was the previous editor-in-chief of this journal. Today, he's one of the world's foremost experts on the psychology of terrorism. Years ago, during an interview, John was asked why he began studying terrorism, and here is what he said. I was taking a social psychology class at the University College Cork one day, And Professor Max Taylor had just finished teaching us about the Milgram experience on obedience to authority. The idea that extreme behavior can often develop from mundane beginnings was the most profound thing I had ever heard. In the next class, Professor Taylor went on to tell us about how the same dynamics worked inside terrorist groups, and I was hooked. So, Max, clearly you've inspired a new generation of scholars to continue your legacy and your research through your teaching, through your research, and of course through many years of editing this journal, Terrorism and Political Violence. So, on behalf of all my colleagues in this field, I want to thank you sincerely. And of course, thank you very much for your time on this conversation.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk.